It's been 2.5 months since Bernard L. Madoff was picked up and charged with what's believed to be the largest financial fraud in history. Yet we still don't know much more about the alleged $50 billion scam than what Madoff initially told the FBI agents who arrested him. There are still no indictments as federal prosecutors continue to unravel the case and to try and figure out exactly what happened and who all was involved. But the proof that it happened can be found in the ruined lives of thousands of victims. The one person who knows the most and is willing to talk is Harry Markopolos, the man who figured out Madoff's scheme before anyone else. He sat down with us for his only television interview. Until a few months ago, Harry Markopolos was an obscure financial analyst and mildly eccentric fraud investigator from Boston, who most people would never notice on the street.
My modern Greek hero, how you doing?
But today he enjoys an almost heroic status, pursued by journalists and movie producers and honored by colleagues as the man who went to the Securities and Exchange Commission and blew the whistle on Bernie Madoff and his $50 billion fraud.
Thank you. Thank you. Please take your seats.
But he seems uncomfortable with all the attention and knows that he is no hero.
I stand before you, a $50 billion failure.
How many times did you send material to the SEC?
May 2000, October 2001, October, November, and December 2005, then again June 2007, and finally April 2008. So 5 separate SEC submissions.
And in spite of all of the things that you did, it still ended up in disaster.
There's nothing to be proud about in this case. I feel horrible about the result. It's been a total disaster for the victims.
It began a decade ago when Markopolos was working for a Boston investment firm. His boss told him that Bernard Madoff, a former chairman of the NASDAQ stock exchange, was running a huge unregistered hedge fund that was producing incredible returns. He wanted Harry to reverse engineer its trading strategy and revenue streams so that the firm could duplicate Madoff's results.
He had the patina of being a respected citizen, one of the most successful businessmen in New York, and certainly one of the most powerful men on Wall Street. You would never suspect him of fraud unless you knew the math.
I mean, you're like a math guy, right?
I've taken all the calculus courses from integral calculus to differential calculus, as well as linear algebra, and statistics, both normal and non-normal.
How long did it take you to figure out that there was something wrong?
It took me 5 minutes to know that it was a fraud. It took me another almost 4 hours of mathematical modeling to prove that it was a fraud.
What were the things that caught your attention?
It was the performance line. As we know, that markets go up and down, and his only went up. He had very few down months. Only 4% of the months were down months, and that would be equivalent to a baseball player in the major leagues batting .960 for a year. Clearly impossible. You would suspect cheating immediately.
Maybe he was just good.
No one's that good.
Harry said there were only 2 plausible explanations. Either Madoff was using insider information to rack up huge profits, or he was running a giant Ponzi scheme.
So either way, he was doing something illegal.
Either way, I knew he was going to go to prison.
In May of 2000, Markopolos took his suspicions about Bernie Madoff to the Boston office of the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Did you have any financial motive?
Yes. He was a competitor of mine in 2000 to 2004 while I was still in the industry. And when someone's competing on your playing field, who's a dirty player, you want him tossed off the field.
He also thought he might be eligible for a sizable reward if the fraud involved insider trading, but that turned out not to be the case.
In your first letter to the SEC back in 2000, you're a little tentative. You say, look, I have no smoking gun.
In 2000, it was more theoretical. In 2001, it was a little bit more real. By 2005, I had 29 red flags that you just couldn't miss on. By 2005, the degree of certainty was approaching 100%.
Over time, and with some simple math calculations, Markopolos concluded that for Madoff to execute the trading strategy he said he was using, he would have had to buy more options on the Chicago Options Exchange than actually existed. Yet he says no one he spoke to there remembered making a single trade with Bernie Madoff's fund.
I would talk to the people I had trading relationships with and ask, did you have a trading relationship with Mr. Bernard Madoff? And they all said, no, we don't think he's for real.
Could you find anybody?
I found no one that ever traded with Mr. Madoff, and I traded with the largest equity derivatives firms in the world.
And that's because Madoff's investment fund never actually made any trades, at least going back to 1993 and probably further. A fact confirmed last week at a meeting of Madoff investors by the trustee charged with liquidating his assets. No one knew the depth of the fraud, but a lot of people had questions.
Who else figured this out besides you?
I would say that hundreds of people suspected something was amiss with the Madoff operation. If you look at who the victims were not, you'll notice that the major firms on Wall Street had no money with Mr. Madoff.
I mean, you write this is the letter, I'm quoting from the letter to the Securities and Exchange Commission, red flag number 20. Madoff is suspected of being a fraud by some of the world's largest, most sophisticated financial services firms. And then you list some of the firms.
Yes, I do.
The biggest firms on Wall Street, and conversations with people high up in those firms.
That is correct. And the SEC ignored that.
Did they call any of these people?
All the SEC had to do was pick up the phone. They never did.
If you had executives at the biggest investment houses in Wall Street that knew something was wrong, why do you think they didn't go to the SEC?
Because people in glass houses don't throw stones, and self-regulation on Wall Street doesn't work.
In January 2006, the New York office of the Securities and Exchange Commission finally opened a case file to look into Harry's allegations about Bernie Madoff. Despite uncovering evidence that Madoff had misled them about his investment activities, the SEC closed the case 11 months later without ever opening a formal investigation. The staff said there was no evidence of fraud.
What I found out from my dealings with the SEC over 8.5 years is that their people are totally untrained in finance, they're unschooled, most of them are just merely lawyers without any financial industry experience.
Well, if the people there aren't trained in securities work, what are they trained in?
How to look at pieces of paper that the securities laws require. They can check every piece of paper perfectly and find misdemeanors, and they'll miss all the financial felonies that are occurring because they never look there. Even when pointed to fraud, they're incapable of finding fraud.
No one at the SEC would talk to us on the record about Harry Markopoulos's allegations, but one person who seemed to have had a high opinion of the agency was Bernie Madoff.
I'm very close with the regulator, so I'm not trying to say that they can't, that what they do is bad. As a matter of fact, my niece just married one.
Besides his niece's husband, who no longer works at the SEC, Madoff has had long-standing ties to the agency and has been called upon to give advice. At this 2007 meeting of a nonprofit group called the Philoctetes Center, Madoff seemed to think the SEC was doing a great job.
In today's regulatory environment, it's virtually impossible to violate rules. And this is something that the public really doesn't understand. But it's impossible for you to for a violation to go undetected. Certainly not for a considerable period of time.
But don't try and tell that to the Philoctetes Center today. Its main benefactor, the Betty and Norman Levy Foundation, was fully invested in Madoff, one of dozens of charitable organizations that have been devastated or wiped out. Madoff's customer list, single-spaced with small type, is 162 pages long, with victims running the gamut from Hollywood royalty to a carpenter's pension fund in Syracuse, New York. Shelley Ludlow has been forced to put her mother in a Medicaid-assisted living facility while she packed up their apartment to move in with a friend, all because of Bernie Madoff.
Our whole lives were turned upside down by this man that sits in his penthouse and smirks.
The same day last week, 70 miles away, Len and Marge Forrest were leaving their house that they had just sold in Setauket, Long Island, and were preparing to drive to South Florida to sell their home there. They had their money with Bernie Madoff for 30 years and lost an 8-figure family fortune 2 days before his 80th birthday.
Do you have any money to live on?
Enough, I would say, for 60 days.
Do you know other people who are in the same situation?
Oh, yes. We have a lot. Unfortunately, and I think probably the thing that tears me up more than anything is the fact that I recommended Madoff to a number of people. And they lost their money, and I'll never stop feeling responsible for that. They were all close family and friends.
Len Forrest and his friends thought they were part of a small, exclusive group of investors lucky enough to have a connection with Bernie Madoff. And because they thought they were making 12% a year, they weren't inclined to ask a lot of questions. Harry Markopoulos called it the classic affinity scam.
An affinity scam is when you prey on groups that are similar in nature to yourself. So I'm Greek. If I was going to run an affinity scam, I would run it on the Greek-American community here. Bernie was Jewish, so he ran it on the Jewish community in the United States, but that wouldn't get him enough customers because he always needed new money to keep the scheme going.
Over time, Madoff extended his reach from New York to Palm Beach, where he enlisted hundreds of wealthy clients, many of them recruited from his own country clubs. And he also made connections that gave him entree to Europe and the hedge fund capital of America, Greenwich, Connecticut. It was here that Bernie Madoff made some of his biggest deals with large investment firms that were willing to feed him billions of dollars of their clients' money to manage. And in return, Bernie Madoff agreed to pay these so-called feeder funds a fortune in annual fees. The largest of the feeder funds was the Fairfield Greenwich Group. How much money did Fairfield make off Bernie Madoff every year?
Hundreds of millions of dollars.
If you're a feeder fund, what are you supposed to do for those hundreds of millions of dollars?
You're supposed to identify the world's best hedge fund managers and invest only in them, and you're supposed to make sure they're not running Ponzi schemes.
The real steroids here were the feeder funds. That's what made it an international Ponzi scheme.
Attorney David Boies is one of the most prominent lawyers in the country and is representing Fairfield Greenwich investors who lost nearly $7 billion when Madoff went under. They're suing the firm for gross negligence, claiming it failed to investigate Madoff thoroughly or monitor his activities as it promised to do in its marketing materials.
Analysis of portfolio composition, portfolio stress testing, risk management, asset verification. Do you think that really happened?
No, we know it didn't happen because we know all they did was turn the money over to Bernie Madoff, and they did that for 20 years.
They did nothing.
They essentially did nothing except lose their investors' money and enjoy very luxurious lifestyles from the money they took out.
Walter Knoll, one of the founding partners of Fairfield Greenwich, declined to talk to us and has reportedly been lying low with his wife at their compound on the private island of Mystique. But in a statement to 60 Minutes, his firm said that it too was a victim of Bernie Madoff, that it had placed too much trust in his then impeccable reputation, and in the fact that there had been multiple reviews of Madoff by the SEC.
What do you have to say for yourself?
In the end, Harry Markopoulos had been right about Bernie Madoff. He will be going to prison, but not because of anything that Harry or the SEC did. In a bad economy, Madoff's lies simply collapsed under their own weight.
No one was investigating Mr. Madoff at the end.
So he turned himself in before anybody in a position of authority began a serious investigation.
That's typically how the SEC does it. They come in after the crime has been committed. They toe tag the victims, count the bodies, and try to figure out who the crooks were after the fact, which does none of us any good.
Wall Street in shreds, the watchdogs fast asleep. Bonus-stuffed executives laughing all the way out of the busted banks. It's been some year. Oh, and we left out the Ponzi scheme of Ponzi schemes. Bernard Madoff's untidy little business that bilked thousands of people out of billions of dollars. While the mastermind is doing 150 years in prison, the big question is, where did all the money go? Irving Picard, the court-appointed trustee, the Liquidator, is searching for the billions that disappeared and trying to recover as much as possible from Madoff's remaining assets. It's a daunting and thankless task. For while he's suing whoever he can on behalf of the victims, he's also suing many of the victims, those who he says benefited and should have known they were investing in a house of cards. Mr. Picard and his chief counsel, David Sheehan, have been largely silent about the details of the recovery until tonight. Last November, just before the whole thing collapsed, Bernard Madoff sent out statements to his clients. How much were they told they were worth?
about $64.8 billion.
So the statements were total lies.
Yes, absolutely.
The $64.8 billion that investors thought they had was just an illusion, designed by Madoff to keep investors investing. Last December, the roof fell in.
Mr. Madoff, what would you say to all those people that lost money, Mr. Madoff?
Mr. Madoff has no say in the matter. If the victims want money back, they'll have to go through Mr. Picard, the decider, and his bloodhound, Mr. Sheehan. How much real money do you think went into the whole scheme?
I'd say about 36 billion, and about 18 of it went out before the collapse, and 18 of it's just missing. And that $18 billion is what we're trying to get back.
So for the past 9 months, Picard and his team have been on a global treasure hunt. The first step, liquidation. Madoff's boats, his art, even his season tickets to the New York Mets, plus Bernie's various homes, all sold or about to be sold, with a U.S. Marshal as real estate pitchman.
Your eyes are drawn directly to the chandelier, which is probably worth a pretty penny.
They didn't exactly hide their wealth, did they?
They did have the house in Palm Beach. They had a place in Montauk. They had an apartment here in Park Avenue in the city, all of which are the accoutrements of great wealth. But it wasn't an extraordinary lifestyle.
How much is all that total?
According to the government, it's over $50 million.
Just a drop in an oversized bucket. Nothing close to what investors lost. So Picard and his team continued to follow the money. They started here. So this was the scene of the crime. Madoff's New York offices, an impressive landscape of emptiness.
His desk was here.
And close by, perhaps a work of art that sums up the entire story.
It was called the soft screw. And it was about 4 to 6 feet high. And it was sitting right here.
And sitting on top of the world was Madoff himself.
He was much like the Wizard of Oz, just hiding behind this wall, and no one could quite penetrate it, but they sort of really liked the results.
As far as you've been able to find out, was he ever legitimate?
No, it was never legitimate. And I think to be told the truth, which he's not capable of, he would then say, yes, I started out as a crook, and I ended up as a crook.
And a crook who looked after his family. Picard's team unearthed records showing Madoff's sons, Mark and Andrew, who ran a legitimate trading operation, and Madoff's brother Peter, the chief compliance officer, took $80 million in compensation over the past 7 years, plus millions more in personal expenses charged to the company, private jet rentals, ski vacations, and country club dues. Even Ruth, Madoff's wife, had a company credit card, and she charged millions too on everything from shopping sprees in Paris to movie rentals, all courtesy of Bernard L. Madoff Securities. Thank you very much.
They used the bank account at BLMIS like a personal piggy bank.
Of all the people that should have known, his brother and his sons who worked under the same roof with him should have known.
One would think so.
Yes.
Did they know?
My belief is, yes, they knew. And the reason I believe that is they were officers of these companies and directors in certain instances as well, and also compliance officers in a very highly regulated environment. So I think clearly they would have to have known what was going on, given their own personal transactions, the longevity of what was happening, and their responsibilities as officers of the company.
Madoff's sons and brother also had accounts with Bernie, and their returns were simply spectacular.
There is sort of an extraordinary event with Peter, his brother. After 1995, we only see him putting $14 in, and he took out over $16 million. We have to take a hard look at that.
Picard says Mark and Andrew Madoff withdrew over $35 million from accounts that were opened with little or no original investment. If they turn out to be untouchable criminally, do you intend to bankrupt them civilly?
Whether or not they have a criminal problem, we will pursue them as far as we can pursue them. And if that leads to bankrupting them, then that's what will happen.
Picard and Sheehan told us they plan to file suit this week against Madoff's sons, Mark and Andrew, his brother Peter, and niece Shauna, accusing them of negligence and breach of fiduciary duty in their roles at the company. He'll be seeking the return of $198 million that was paid out, loaned, or transferred to them.
When his brother took out money, or his sons took out money, they took customer money.
Can you lay claim to the son's real estate, for example?
I believe that we can. The money that went to buy these houses under the law is called fraudulent transfers.
Maybe, but the Madoff sons are claiming they're still owed nearly $90 million by their father's bankrupt company.
Mr. Madoff?
Mark Madoff and the other family members maintain their innocence and declined our request for an interview.
I have no comment. I'm sorry, I can't help you.
But in a statement, the Madoff sons say Picard's allegations are baseless, that they had no prior knowledge of Bernard Madoff's crimes.
If you were those sons, and you knew what you knew today about where all that money came from, wouldn't you be embarrassed to keep that money? They should give it all back. And if they don't give it all back, I think we have an obligation to go get it and take it all back.
And that includes Mother Madoff, Ruth. Though she's already agreed to forfeit about $80 million in assets, Picard has sued to keep her on a very short leash. At the moment, any time she spends over $100, she has to check in with you, correct?
She reports it to us at the end of a month.
And how is she living now?
Very modestly.
The most significant amount of money that Ruth is currently spending is on lawyers.
There is an assumption in this case that there is this stash out there, whether in Swiss banks or under the mattress. Are you assuming there is?
Yes, we
Yes.
What kind of money are we talking about?
Would assume it millions and millions of dollars.
Millions and millions isn't nearly enough to cover the billions stolen by Bernie Madoff. But here's where the story takes an odd twist. Most of the money for victims will not come from the Madoff family, but from some of the victims themselves. Most people assume that everyone lost money who dealt with Madoff.
Right.
Not true.
We've found that there have been quite a few people who have gotten out more than they put in.
In fact, about half of Madoff's thousands of victims are what Picard calls net winners, people who took out more money than they ever invested with Madoff.
We can tell that if Morley put in $100 and he got out $200, he got $100 of somebody else's money.
So the guy who's been happily taking $25,000 a year out over, say, 10 years, he's not going to get a dime out of this.
No.
Not if he took out more than he put in.
Well, say he put in an initial $100,000.
Then he's already got more than he put in. He's been overpaid.
And are you going to try and get the difference?
Perhaps.
And he's entitled by law to get that difference back. It goes by the nicely nasty name of a clawback. If any investor took out more than they put in over the past 6 years, Picard can legally demand it back to help victims who didn't take money out. For now, Picard says Madoff's small-time winners are not his priority. He's focusing on the big winners, who claim to be innocent victims.
Now, some of the big players, I believe, actually knew exactly what was going on and participated in it.
Picard and Sheehan have sued several prominent Madoff investors saying they knew or should have known of the fraud, like billionaire investor and philanthropist Jeffrey Pickauer.
He got a statement that said his return was 950%. Now, this isn't some unsophisticated rube buying these stocks and dealing in this. This is a very, very sophisticated guy. He gets a statement like that. That's off the charts. He doesn't know anything about that.
So is he a prime suspect?
Sure. I think not only in terms of the monies that he took out, but the records with regard to the relationship, the manipulation and backdating of trades. You had to know, or someone knew, it was false.
The suit claims Pickauer took out more than $5 billion in profits since 1995. Picard is also suing another billionaire investor, Stanley Chase, who withdrew over $1 billion in profits. Both Chase and Pickauer maintain their innocence and would not comment. But in court papers, Pickauer characterizes the suit as unsupported by facts or logic. Sheehan says he thinks they knew all along and simply couldn't resist the easy money.
I think as everyone was participating in this and just feeding at this trough of greed, at the end of it, what they were looking for was it to continue. They were hoping it was never going to end.
So far, the trustee and his counsel have filed 13 lawsuits seeking the return of nearly $15 billion from the biggest Madoff investors. In addition, 233 clawback notices have gone out to Madoff friends and family who may have profited from the scheme.
This is a human tragedy. If it was
Thousands of smaller investors who were living off what they believed were legitimate profits now fear that on top of their lost nest egg, they may end up owing even more.
I open my mailbox wondering if this will be the day when the letter arrives.
Sheehan is sympathetic, but
at the end of the day, they're in a Ponzi scheme, unfortunately for them. So all they get, at best, is what they put in. And to claim that they should be getting something other than that is to suggest that some other resource should exist. I'm talking about the taxpayers coming in funding this.
So far, Picard has found nearly $1.5 billion for the victims' fund, and he's hoping to get several $billion more. But even then, victims will collect only a tiny fraction of what they lost.
We don't know how much is there, but it's going to be not necessarily pennies on the dollar, but it's only a little bit more than that. We're not going to be able to repay everyone. Not anything close to what they lost.
Madoff. It is a name that will live in infamy. It's been nearly 3 years since Bernard Madoff confessed to running a $65 billion Ponzi scheme, the largest financial fraud in history. Thousands of trusting clients who felt safe investing with a financial genius were swindled. He hadn't invested a penny. While Madoff is serving 150 years in prison, his family has had to deal with the consequences of his crimes. His wife Ruth divested of most of her great wealth and derided by a suspicious world. Their son Mark dead, driven to suicide by shame and accusations of guilt. Their other son Andrew isolated, trying to live with the disgrace. Are they innocent or were they willing partners? For the first time since Bernie Madoff's arrest, his son Andrew and wife Ruth speak out about crime, punishment, and the shame of being a Madoff. It's a tough name to live with.
It sure is.
Ruth Madoff, you feel the shame?
Of course I feel the shame. I could barely walk down the street without worrying about people recognizing me.
And Andrew Madoff.
From the very beginning of this whole episode, I've had absolutely nothing to hide. And I've been eager, I would say almost desperate, to speak out publicly and tell people that I'm absolutely not involved.
Andrew and Ruth Madoff speak out in the book Truth and Consequences, a more or less tell-all arranged by Andrew's fiancée, Catherine Hooper, an attempt to separate the family from the father's crimes. Is it dismaying for you that no matter what you say, people aren't going to believe you?
I think in many ways it is dismaying, but public opinion has to be something that doesn't matter to us. What matters to us is the truth.
It's really hard for people to believe that you didn't know, that you must have known.
I can't explain it. I mean, I trusted him. Why would it ever occur to me that it wasn't legal? The business was, his reputation was almost legendary. Why would I ever think that there was something sinister going on?
It was 1954 when Ruth Alpern met Bernie Madoff in Queens, New York.
I just saw him and I was sort of swept away, I think.
She married him at age 18. They had 2 sons, Mark, then Andrew. Bernie was building up his money management business, a typical middle-class family living on Long Island.
We were both solid parents and valued our family and so proud of our boys. It was a dream, really.
My father was certainly present as a dad.
Did he emphasize moral values at all?
I wouldn't say that we sort of explicitly discussed values, but we certainly lived what I felt was a moral life where there was a clear sense of right and wrong.
Exactly when Bernie Madoff went wrong is unclear, but as his reputation for delivering steady profits grew, the Madoffs began living the good life. A penthouse in Manhattan, homes in Palm Beach and the south of France, and yachts in both places. The family became celebrated for philanthropy, and Madoff became a Wall Street big shot.
He was a big figure in the industry. He was the chairman of NASDAQ. He was constantly being honored as Man of the Year of this organization and that had an effect on me.
Both sons went to work as traders for their father's firm in the late 80s, a time authorities believe Madoff's Ponzi scheme was well underway. Why would your father want to taint his sons by bringing into a situation that could well spell disaster?
You know, that's a great question, and that's something that I really agonize over as a son. You know, what my father did was so horrible, and it's hard for me to understand that, and I'm not any closer to understanding it now than I was 3 years ago.
Bernard L. Madoff Securities employed over 100 people, but it seemed like a family business. His brother Peter and several cousins worked there. Mark and Andrew worked on the 19th floor of New York's Lipstick Building, where they legitimately traded securities for the firm and for outside clients. The investment advisory business, the Ponzi scheme, was housed 2 floors below, where their father never made any trades at all. He was simply creating phony paper statements that showed steady profits for his clients, his victims. Access to the 17th floor was highly restricted. You must have been curious about why the 17th floor was such a secret place. When you or Mark asked him about his end of the business, what did he say?
It was always a very similar response, is you guys have your business to worry about and let me worry about my business, and the conversation would end there.
But people say, look, there's no way these kids could not have, at the very least, suspected something was going on.
Well, keep in mind, these were completely separate businesses. We were executing hundreds of thousands of transactions a day, and that kept all of us incredibly busy. And it just didn't occur to me that he could be involved in any kind of criminal activity.
Andrew says his father would often walk his clients through the 19th floor to show actual trades being made. You feel that the legitimacy of the trading business offered protection to what your father was doing?
Absolutely, absolutely.
That he was using you and your brother?
Absolutely. It was one of the hardest things to come to grips with in trying to get my head around this, was that feeling that I had been used almost as a human shield by him. It's unforgivable. No father should do that to their sons.
The basic concept of Wall Street.
He says he thought his father was a financial genius. There were suspicions about Madoff's remarkably consistent returns, but the SEC repeatedly cleared him of any wrongdoing. What troubled Andrew was his father's refusal to discuss any plans for a succession.
His plan was that he had no plan, and he would say that when he dies, his end of the business dies, and again, it was always the same response. That's the way it is, and it's not going to change.
He ruled with an iron fist, but kept everyone happy with money, steady returns for investors, and for family, an endless stream of cash. Andrew and Mark were paid multi-million-dollar salaries, and the boys went to their father for even more, for houses, business ventures, and divorce settlements. Catherine Hooper says the Madoff benign dictatorship took some getting used to.
It was an adjustment, getting to understand that the boundaries in Andrew's family were probably going to be different than what I was used to.
Did you feel that Papa Madoff was the boss?
There's no question that he was.
He could be a bully, without question.
Did you ever suspect along the way either strange behavior or somebody who was bottling up a secret or any of that?
I never did. I never did. It didn't seem that way. There was nothing that would make me suspect anything.
I mean,
Sometimes I look back and I think as the years went on, he started to get more and more short-tempered, and maybe he just was having trouble, obviously. He had to be.
In the fall of 2008, the world economy began to implode, and markets were in free fall. Big investors wanted out. Redemption after redemption strained Madoff's scheme to its limits. On December 10, 2008, with only a few $100 million left of the billions invested with him, Madoff realized the game was over. He told his wife to transfer $10 million from her brokerage account at the firm into a personal checking account. Did you not wonder what on earth is happening here? $10 million is a lot of money.
It wasn't atypical for him to put money in an account and take it out. I didn't think anything of it, actually.
That same morning, Bernard Madoff called a family meeting in his office.
And he started to try and speak to us, and he couldn't. He sort of fell apart, started to cry a little bit, and it was shocking to see that. I mean, this was not a man who was emotional in that way at all. He said that maybe it would be easier if we talked elsewhere, and he suggested maybe we should go up to his apartment.
He called from the office and said, "I'm coming home with the boys. I have something to talk about." He came in, we went into a room, 4 of us, and he said, "I have a confession to make. I've been running a Ponzi scheme." He said $50 billion.
He said, "Everything I've been doing is all a big lie." He said, the business is a Ponzi scheme, and the firm is completely insolvent, and I'm broke. And then he just started sobbing, and I was shocked. I felt like my head exploded. I mean, I don't think if he had told me he was an alien, I could have been more surprised. He said that the firm had liabilities of $50 billion. It never occurred to me that his business had anything like that anything like that under management. It was shocking.
Your mother, what was her reaction?
She looked shocked. She asked, "What's a Ponzi scheme?" It was her first question. She didn't even understand that. I think it was me who answered and said that it means that it's all fake, that Dad's, he's not been doing what he says he's been doing. And he followed that up and said, "Yes, I've been lying to all of you all of these years. I've been lying to everybody. I've been lying to myself," he said.
And your brother?
My brother was trembling with rage. He was absolutely furious. Mark was the first one to stand up and said, "I'm out of here." And he stormed out of the room, and I immediately followed him and walked out.
There's a lot of people out there who are saying, or will be saying as they watch this is all a charade. This was something that the Madoffs set up to get himself off the hook.
I wish it were. I wish it were. I wish none of this was real. I knew absolutely nothing about this before my father shared the information with me, and it was the most shocking and terrible moment of my life.
I was as stunned as they. I was kind of paralyzed. Bernie got up and said, "I'm going back to the office."
Was he emotional in any way?
I don't remember that either. He must have been.
Apologetic in any way?
Probably, yes. It's sort of a blank now. I'm not hedging here. I just simply don't remember every detail. I was in such a state.
And later that day, that evening, You both turned up at the office Christmas party.
I know, he phoned me from the office and said, we have to go to the office Christmas party. So I got myself together and went over there. We stayed a half an hour, and we just went home. And the next morning, the FBI was there to arrest him at about 7 a.m.
Andrew and Mark Madoff had turned their father in. Shortly after the arrest, Ruth Madoff called Andrew, pleading with him to co-sign his father's $10 million bail bond.
And I said, you know, forget it. There's no way. I mean, how could you even ask that question? No, I'm not signing that bail bond. That's crazy. And I was really, I was very upset that she asked, because here I had just turned my father in to the authorities a day before. And now it appeared that I was losing my mother as well, because she was siding with him.
I just wanted him to come home. I was so afraid.
Afraid of?
I mean, the whole idea of going to prison was sort of unthinkable to me. I don't think I ever knew anybody that went to prison.
Mr. Madoff, what do you have to say for yourself?
Bail was eventually guaranteed by Ruth and Madoff's brother Peter, and Bernie was released. All of his assets were frozen. But in a stunning breach of the court order barring the transfer of property, a large and extremely valuable envelope arrived at Andrew Madoff's apartment.
I tore open the envelope and dumped it out, and it was absolutely heartbreaking. These were pieces of jewelry that I recognized, things that I had seen my mother wearing over the years. And I couldn't understand how she could do this. I mean, what were they thinking? And it wasn't until 3 years later that I had a chance to ask her, what were you thinking when you sent me that jewelry? I don't understand. And she told me that she and my father planned to kill themselves. And they put together that package beforehand and sent it out.
Did they try to kill themselves?
Yes, they did.
I don't know whose idea it was, but we decided to kill ourselves because it was so horrendous what was happening. We had terrible phone calls, hate mail, just beyond anything. And I said, I just can't go on anymore. That's when I packed up some things to send to my sons and my grandchildren. I had some lovely antique things and things that I thought they might want. I mailed them. It was Christmas Eve. That added to the whole depression. We took pills and woke up the next day.
What did you take?
I think Ambien.
How many?
I don't even remember. I took what we had. He took more.
Did you leave notes?
No. It was very impulsive, and I'm glad we woke up.
But you must have talked. This is a rather large decision to make.
It wasn't hard at the time. It was impulsive, and I just wanted out.
When we come back, life in the Madoff apartment and the death of a son. The sheer scale of Bernard Madoff's Ponzi scheme shocked the world. Thousands of individuals, charities, and funds that on paper were worth a total of $65 billion were wiped out. What's more, some of his closest friends and family who had trusted him with their life savings faced ruin.
30 seconds, Dave.
With Madoff under house arrest, the world staked out his penthouse on 64th Street, obsessed by what might be happening behind the drawn shades.
There were lawyers coming for meetings at the apartment. We watched a lot of television, and I cooked.
Was there remorse? Was there
Yes, there was
guilt?
remorse.
Or was it sort of self-pity?
I think in a way he was relieved at the beginning that he was finished.
But you must have asked yourself 1,000 times, why? You could have been a perfectly comfortable, even wealthy family.
Without question.
Without this.
I don't understand it. It's hard for me to say this, but I don't think the money was the part of it. I think he got stuck. That's what he said. And he didn't have the courage to face things when they might have been able to be faced on a much smaller scale.
Madoff repeatedly told authorities that he had acted alone.
Did your wife have anything to do with this, sir?
That his family knew nothing. But who would believe Bernie Madoff?
I remember at some point we were having breakfast and I said to Andrew, you know, people will think that you were involved. And I think it had dawned on him, but it really hadn't sunk in. And as I said those words, he looked at me and said, do you really think, but that won't last. I mean, it'll become clear very quickly that we weren't involved.
Did you have any suspicion at all that your mother might have been involved, complicit in some way?
No, absolutely not. I never for a moment felt that my mother was involved in my father's crimes or was aware of it at all.
The rest of the world was skeptical. While countless stories predicted the imminent arrest of Mark, Andrew, and their uncle Peter,
Do you have anything to say to the investors?
Ruth Madoff seemed to get the worst of it. It was said she had an office at the firm, that she had been the bookkeeper.
I was the bookkeeper. I was the receptionist. I worked for Bernie. In 1961, when I graduated from college, and I left in 1963 when Mark was born, and then Andy, and I was a stay-at-home mom all those years. And later on, when the boys started to work there, we lived within walking distance, and I had an office there where I took care of decorating things and house things and boat bills and managing those things. But I was never the bookkeeper after 1963.
Probably a majority of people can't believe that you can live with someone for 50 years and not know.
It's hard for me to believe, too.
Had you known, would you have turned him in?
I'm glad I didn't. It would have been tough, but I would have left. Whether I turned him in or not, I don't know. I'd like to think I would have, but I couldn't say. I'm being completely honest with you, I have to say.
She was vilified and shunned, harassed on the subway. The press hounded her with headline after headline. Her fiercest critics were her own sons. From the time of your father's confession, I gather you had a certain degree of estrangement from your mother. How come?
Well, she and I barely spoke for 2 years. I struggled tremendously trying to understand her decision to stay by my father's side. I felt so angry with him, so I didn't understand her choice, and I struggled with it, as did Mark.
I never thought of leaving. I don't know why I didn't. I just knew this man for so long, whom I loved for so many years. I didn't know what else to do but stay there.
3 months after his confession, Madoff pled guilty. He was later sentenced to 150 years. Ruth Madoff agreed to forfeit $80 million and all her worldly goods. All the homes, boats, cars, furniture, even Madoff's slippers were auctioned or sold. You were allowed to keep $2.5 million. To a lot of people, that's a lot of money.
It is. It's certainly enough for me. I've used a lot for legal fees.
There is a public perception, and I'm sure you've heard it, that there's got to be a stash somewhere. You know,
I've heard it. I've heard it.
That Bernie Madoff hid it somewhere, and that you know about it,
I wish they'd find it and give it all back.
Or you both know about it.
My understanding of a Ponzi scheme is that when it's over, there's nothing left, and I certainly don't know of a stash anywhere.
Though 8 employees have been accused of helping with the scheme, no family members have been charged. But the bankruptcy trustee, Irving Picard, and his lead counsel, David Sheehan, are demanding that all the Madoffs cough up virtually every penny they have, claiming they, quote, knew or should have known about Bernie's crimes. Would you agree with Mr. Sheehan, the lawyer for the trustee, when Sheehan says you should be ashamed that you should give every penny back?
Well, obviously I disagree with many of the assertions in the lawsuit that the trustee has filed against me. And I'm hopeful that in time we'll be able to reach a settlement and I'll be able to put this behind me.
Picard says the son's trading operation received millions from Bernie's Ponzi scheme. He's suing Andrew Madoff alone for $60 million, virtually every penny he earned, borrowed, or was given to him by his father over a 10-year period. Let me ask a really intrusive question. How much are you worth as we speak?
Well, I was fortunate over the years running the business that Mark and I ran that generated many millions of dollars in profits and enabled my brother and I both to live a comfortable lifestyle.
You haven't answered the question.
I made, in good years, several million dollars. You know, my life at this point is an open book. The details of my financial past have been laid bare completely in the lawsuit against me. I haven't enjoyed it, but that's the reality that I live in.
Do you fear ending up broke?
I think that it's a very real possibility, but I am prepared to start over again and build myself back up.
Have you talked to your dad?
I have no comment. I'm sorry, I can't help you.
But for Andrew's brother Mark, the weight of the lawsuits, attacks from the media, and the shame became unbearable.
He was absolutely obsessed with the news coverage. He would wake up every morning, immediately comb through the regular newspapers, and that would be followed up by reading blog posts and comments. And I would say, look, you got to shut off your computer. You got to stop subjecting yourself to this because this is not helpful for you, and it's not helpful for me. And if you keep doing this, it's just going to lead to misery.
And it did. On December 11th, 2010, the second anniversary of his father's arrest, Mark Madoff hung himself, while his 2-year-old son slept in the next room. He said in his last email, "No one wants to hear the truth."
As soon as we saw the caller ID at that early hour on a Saturday morning, we both knew what had happened.
How did you react when you heard that?
It was awful. I wish I could say I was shocked, but I wasn't. He had tried to kill himself a little more than a year before, and that was absolutely devastating. And I had tried to talk to him to understand what he was going through. It was very painful for me and very difficult for me, but I was making it through. And to see him struggling and not making it was terrible. We were very close. He was my best friend, and I wanted to help him.
The night before he killed himself, there was an awful article in the Wall Street Journal. I mean, I understood I was going through those agonies of shame, and it was terrible to feel that we were always so proud of who we were and Bernie's success in the industry. It was so difficult.
She blames herself for Mark's suicide. He'd wanted her to cut off all contact with her husband.
I just wish, until my dying day, that I had done what he wanted. I don't know if it would have made a difference or not, but if I could change things, at least if I had tried, I would have felt a little better. I don't know if it would have mattered. It's the most awful thing that can happen to anybody. Suicide of a child.
After her son's death, Ruth Madoff told her husband she was finished with him. No visits, no phone calls. That decision led to a reconciliation of sorts with Andrew.
That's partly why I'm sitting right here. He and Catherine wanted to write this book. They thought it would be good if I was a part of it, and I agreed because I wanted to reconcile.
Neither Ruth nor Andrew will benefit from sales of the book. Catherine Hooper will. You live just over there. You miss the apartment?
Not really.
She lives a simpler life now in a 3-room apartment in South Florida. But she remains Ruth Madoff, lawful wife of the greatest financial criminal in history. Why haven't you filed for a divorce from this man?
I don't know. It doesn't matter to me. He's going to die in prison. I certainly don't want to find another man these days.
He'll probably see this interview. Are you concerned about it?
I was thinking about that. No, I'm not concerned. He should hear it.
Believe her or not, the thousands of victims may have little sympathy for Andrew and Ruth, but it can't be denied that they too are victims of Bernie Madoff. That's Mark and Andrew.
Mm-hmm. In happier times.
They lost a son and brother and will forever carry the shame of the Madoff name.
What he did to me, to my brother, and to my family is unforgivable. What he did to thousands of other people, destroyed their lives. I'll never understand it, and I'll never forgive him for it, and I'll never speak to him again.